Hello, all. Welcome and good evening to the eighth meet of the lecture series of the IOE project titled Print as Resistance and Proscription as Control, a cultural history of banned Hindi and Urdu print in colonial North India, circa 1850 to 1947. I am Shirini from the Department of English, University of Hyderabad, and I would be hosting today's lecture meet. Today's welcome note would be addressed by Dr. Gajendra Pathak from the Department of Hindi, University of Hyderabad. Currently, he's serving as the HOD of the department. The meeting is chaired by Dr. Ravikant, Associate Professor of History, CSDS, New Delhi. I invite Dr. Gajendra Pathak to open today's welcome note.
नमस्कार, आप सबका स्वागत है। ये 8वीं कड़ी है हमारे प्रोजेक्ट की और आज हमारे बीच डॉक्टर विजय रामदास जी इतिहास विभाग से हैं। रविकांत जी नमस्कार। और ये आज की बातचीत हमारे
नमस्ते। हाँ
जी उन दो साम्राज्यवादी ताकतों को समझने में मददगार होगी जो लंबे समय तक हमारे मालिक रहे, फ्रांस और इंग्लैंड। जो प्रतिबंध और सेंसरशिप, प्रेस की स्वतंत्रता, सारी चीज़ों पर हमारा प्रोजेक्ट लंबे समय से विचार कर रहा है, बातचीत हम लोग कर रहे हैं। इस कड़ी में इतिहास के अनेक विद्वानों को हम सुन चुके हैं। आज का यह व्याख्यान विशेष रूप से इसलिए भी महत्वपूर्ण मुझे लग रहा है कि हम उनकी धरती पर जाकर उनके इतिहास के उन 300 वर्षों पर बात करें, जिन 300 वर्षों तक लगभग थोड़ा कम बेसी उन्होंने हमें गुलाम बनाए रखा है। आप सबका बहुत बहुत स्वागत है इस आयोजन में, इस कड़ी में। आप लोग जुड़े। सिडनी, आप स्वागत का परिचय दें और फिर इस कार्यक्रम को आगे बढ़ाएं। धन्यवाद
जी सर। So I am going to make a brief introduction to today's topic that will be discussed. The contribution and the impact of the printing press and the print culture has been insurmountable in a pre-digital world economy in the way it established channels of communication and correspondence, co-terminus with all the major events in the historical timeline. Now, the invention of the movable type in 1439 by Johannes Gutenberg provided a channel, a means of rapid dissemination of ideas. Therefore, prior to that, a monopoly of those that had the means and capital to access printed or written sources of knowledge and information. In a sense, we see a transition in the nature and proportion of printing and apropos reading culture from elite to masses, from being previously patroned and commissioned to now being printed and sold en masse. In 1517, when Martin Luther stuck his 95 Theses on the chapel door in Wittenberg, the Christian church, and by extension, the whole of humanity in general, saw one of the biggest revolutions, the Great Schism, shortly the Renaissance, the Age of Reason, so on and so forth. A major paradigm shift in the way print capitalism replaced an older regime of theocracy, changing, as it were, the body politic and the conceptions of legitimacy, legality, humanity, right, equality, hitherto upheld by the Western world. Quintessentially, the introduction of what we know as Renaissance humanism. We also see the rise of a celebrity of the author and the new meaning it assumes, which is starkly different from the previous octet. It is in the same span of time we also see a dialogic debate space, as it were, opening up in Europe that question the nature, origin, and legitimacy of the sovereign, and for that matter, the empiricist rationalist debate on the nature and origin of knowledge itself. The origin of political censorship as a tool safeguarding the interests of the ruling class and their particular conception of the world predates print revolution. However, the revolutionary possibilities of resistance and propagation of ideas that could challenge the regime opened up by the print revolution birthed newer strategies and paradigms of political suppression and censorship. Today, we fix our gaze upon the broad movements of the press between 16th and 19th centuries, France and England, and the conditioning relationship that evolved between the acts of political censorship and print revolution. Addressing today's welcome note would be Addressing to today's keynote would be Professor Vijaya Ramadas Mandala. He's an assistant professor in the Department of History in the University of Hyderabad. He has done his PhD from the University of Manchester, UK, and his research interest areas include environment and empire, environmental historiography, British imperial and Commonwealth history, annual studies, colonial governments, cultural geography, environmental histories of the Gonds and the Baigas, colonial education and architecture. I invite Professor Ramdas Mandala to take the floor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Srini Banerjee, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Professor Gajendra Pathak and Professor Ravikant, for making me to part of your ongoing research work. I'm grateful for inviting me for today's talk. And so today's talk, what I'm going to do is it will be divided into two parts. First, I will be speaking about the notion of censorship and freedom of speech in Tudor England, with a specific focus on Queen Elizabeth I regime, how some of the voices were, uh, suppressed during her reign in the latter part of the 16th century, followed by then what is the workmanship of censors during 18th century France. Though my title says 16th to 19th centuries, I will not be going into in-depth understanding of censorship. Rather, I will take the example of Tudor England in the 16th century and 18th century France under the reign of Louis XV to illustrate what is this idea of censorship in a historical sense. It's not just suppressing different antagonist voices or heresy or sedition, but concerning the 18th century France. So based on the works of Downton and some of the archival material I have been reading, since I teach revolutionary Europe in the Department of History at the University of Hyderabad, I will latter part of the lecture will explain to you regarding what is this workmanship of the censors. What is the censorship in the 18th century France when Mala Chefs, one of the French politician, consul, and director of press under Louis XVI was handling different kind of book projects coming in. So I also will give some of the examples of Rousseau and Voltaire, how Louis XV regime was dealing with them. So this will be latter part of the lecture. First part of the lecture will deal with the censorship, but I also will take one of the Latin word licensee to illustrate what is this idea of speech as a practice looked upon by the royal regimes under Tudor England, especially from Henry VIII to Elizabeth II, but also his sister, her predecessor, Queen Mary. All these were Tudor rulers. So give me 1 hour time, sir. So I will be able to, finish both concerning one case study from England and one case study from France. So the early history of censorship in France and England was defined by two significant fears. So when we think about history of the freedom of speech, obviously it was attuned to the question of censorship. So when I say freedom of speech and the question of censorship, whether in Tudor England or under Bourbon rulership, in France during the 18th century, there were two fears associated with this notion of freedom of speech uh, and question of censorship. One is the fear of heresy. The second is fear of sedition. Uh, Actually, this fear of heresy goes back to as early as 13th century, when John Wycliffe in Oxford, in England, began to circulate, Bible in vernacular. He began to preach Bible in English. Latin was the classical language of the Bible around this time. in parts of Europe around 13th century. So John Wycliffe was began to preach for humanity. So it was supposed to given to only the children of the aristocratic groups in 13th century England. So he broke this norm. So the knowledge, which was always under the control of the elites, ruling groups, whether in ancient India or medieval India, uh, or even in ancient Europe or medieval Europe, it was always controlled by uh, powerful groups. So that is one understanding of uh, uh, you know the question of censorship coming into suppressing the freedom of speech. Here, when I say freedom of speech, it's not necessarily speech. It includes writing, reading, circulating, but also speaking. So all these four elements, writing, reading, circulation, but also speaking of anything that deemed seditious to the integrity of a church or state was considered a blasphemy. So this is how we can trace back the origins of censorship in Europe from 13th century onwards, right to the coming of the Renaissance, Reformation, but also Enlightenment. It reached its zenith in France, especially during the 18th century, prior to the outbreak of the French Revolution. So I told two things, always troubled uh, the ruling monarchy in England, but also in France. That is the fear of heresy, other is fear of sedition. So a question arises then, what agency was involved in the early history of censorship in England and France, whether in the 16th century or in the 18th century? So the idea of censorship began to surface when reactions from the established church, then a combined censoring partnership of church and state, later a passing of this partnership under the control of the state. So initially it was the church which was, in the business of censoring the freedom of speech or the freedom of expression, including the moment the printing press came around the 16th century. Church was the initial agency that involved in controlling or conditioning the voices which were going against its biblical principles or the Bible or the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church. So when we look at church and the state in Europe, this is fundamentally different from missionaries in colonial India. This is Europe, and that's how the church was one of the dominant agency of power during the feudal ages, before the coming rise of the kings like Tudors and Stuarts in England. So initially it was church which was involved in censorship because it feared any kind of blasphemy against Bible or Pope would deem which will create social disharmony. So that was the condition of censoring the voices. So John Wycliffe in Oxford in England during the 16th century was actually admonished. He was excommunicated from Christianity, and he was also reprimanded. He was expelled from Oxford for a while. But despite that, he was not hanged or killed, as was the case with many of the those bishops who revolted against the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church, are questioning the handling of the Bible in the hands of Roman Catholic Church. So this is the prior origins of censorship in Europe, which can be traced back to the 13th century. So state only came, I argue that the state intervention came much later. So likewise, in France, as early as 1275, this is also latter part of the 13th century. Philip the Bold, he was a French king around latter part of the 13th century, brought manuscripts under the surveillance of the University of Paris. Paris, the capital of France. I refer as Paris. Paris is the French word for Paris. So as early as the latter part of the 13th century, Philip the Bold brought whatever the manuscripts which were under the distribution in France must have been read by the professors at University of Paris. So most of these professors were, uh, landmen. Shalini, you have a thing to say? Shalini, you have a you rose your hand, right? Shrini, sorry. Shrini, you have a question to ask?
No, sir. I think it was
Okay,
Shalini
okay, there
who
is a,
raised her
okay.
hand.
Someone raised,
I would
okay.
request people to ask their questions when I open the floor for discussion.
Okay, I will finish by in another 40 minutes.
Sure, sir. You continue. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So we are thinking about, as early as 1275, one of the French king, whose name was Philip the Bold, uh, brought manuscripts on the surveillance of the University of Paris. So that this is the first ever entry of censorship introduced by one of the French king, uh, recruiting Paris professors to read whatever the manuscripts, French translations of it, uh, under the control of the University of Paris. However, censorship actually appeared with the advent of printing, when the issue of propagating heretical ideas not only threatened the church initially, but also the rulers eventually, both in France and England. Not until the coming of printing, that is press, the paper, reading of letters. We are no longer speaking. We're no longer conversing without a paper, but we are conversing, but also publishing our ideas in a print format. Then the church began to fear about, losing of its hold on the, societies across. So this is the more rigid kind of, action coming from both the church, but also supported by many rulers in France, but also in England, to suppress or to monitor or to have a surveillance over what kind of works can be published, whether in England or in France. So Francis I lent his support to the church when he issued the Edict of 1521, which prohibited booksellers from printing or selling any book which had not been approved by the Faculty of Theology at the University of Paris. So the Faculty of Theology was the immediate branch where these professors were looking at any kind of translated work, any kind of published work during 1521, uh, whether to accept or reject the publication of book. If it is not offending the state, it is not actually dealing with the issues of the government, then they are giving grant permission. It's called privilege, royal privilege of sanction, approbation. Approbation was given to his books. If they deem qualified after a thorough check by the professors in the theology department at the University of Paris. So that's how this censorship was
पागल है नहीं समझ नहीं
operating
आ रहा
from uh, you know, 13th century onwards. Then in 1533, this faculty had, according to Calvin, condemned obscene works. One of the work is, the Forest of Loan, and other of this ilk. And in 1543, the university issued an index which included the works of, Rabelais, Marot, and Etienne. So any works that were, ridiculing the doctrinal Christianity or the authority of the Pope or feudal structure of England or France were banned. Sometimes, these authors were arrested. They were put into prison. They were also tortured. So this is how censorship was intrinsically linked with censuring not only the free ideas that became, powerful critics of the state and the church, but also condemning some of the people to death. So death was a common feature both in Stuart England, even under the Bourbon rulers, especially when they were some of the works that they are really going against the king. So both church and state were partners in the history of censorship, whether in England during the 16th century or in France during the 18th century. Similarly, church and state controlled printing in 16th century England. For example, King Henry VIII licensed printers. The Tudors enforced strict censorship on any form of sedition and heresy. So, especially the strict kind of censorship, controlling the production of printing, controlling the production of knowledge, began under the reign of King Henry VIII in England during the 16th century. But it was more, went into a kind of zenith under the reign of his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I of England. So Queen Elizabeth I of England, she was ruler in the latter part of the 16th century. That is, from 1558 to 1603 in England. So she had the London printing houses inspected and forbidden books burned by the hangman. So the hangman was one of the state reputed official, both in England, in France, even until 18th century, whose duty was to gather all prohibited books and bring them into, in a public street and burn in front of whether it's Parisians or Londoners, wherever they were. So this hangman duty was to burn all prohibited proscribed literature, books, letters, whatever correspondences were there in print. So Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII, instituted a strict code of censorship. If any letter, any author, any writer, any bishop criticizing her policies were their works were proscribed. They were brought into in London city and burnt alive by a hangman who was a public official. So this was one state's direct control over the freedom of press. So that was the thing. So there is another interesting thing in the case of Elizabeth I. I will get back to that in a few minutes. Poets, bards, and writers in Tudor England often lamented for the loss of their labors to the arbitrary excesses of authority. So whatever I've been telling since the beginning of this lecture informs about how state was exercising its arbitrary authority over the question of freedom. That is the question of freedom of speech, freedom of writing, but also freedom of the production of knowledge. So this was quite typical both under Tudor rulers in England, but also under Bourbons in the 18th century. Then there is one interesting thing. The law courts condemned the poet Bonfants in Book 5 of Spencer's Fairy Queenie. Grounds Jonathan Goldberg's argument that what comes from the poet's mouth belongs to the queen, which means that the poet's liberty is entirely restricted by the monarchical authority. So one of the book called Fairy Queenie was banned during around this time under the reign of Queen Elizabeth. Likewise, Annabelle Patterson relied on the Mirror for Magistrates. Is another work coming from Tudor rule in England in the 16th century. How Colin Bourne was cruelly executed for making a foolish rhyme. So whatever the poetry you can do in a simple style or in an elegant style or with refinement, but it should not attack either the state or the queen or a king or the church, as long as you are not offending state and religious sentiments of the rulers, you are saved. So this is the one lamentation of an English poet during the 16th century. So, but again, one complex thing, it's a complex thing when we study about the history of censorship and the question of the freedom of speech in Tudor England. Elizabeth the first was a Protestant ruler, and her father Henry VIII was a Catholic. So, and her other sister who ruled between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, Queen Mary, who was called Bloody Mary. She persecuted hundreds, thousands of Protestants during middle of the 16th century, and she burnt all books written by any Catholic bishop. So Protestants were immediately, any Protestant writer or any writer professing the faith of Protestantism were imprisoned, tortured, burned to death. Their books were also burnt in public sphere under the reign of Queen Mary, uh, the elder sister of Queen Elizabeth I. But the moment Elizabeth I came, it became another frame comes in, that is, bureaucracy and governmentality. How states governmentality, bureaucracy entered into the realm of censorship. So under Henry VIII, he was quite reticent, quite liberal concerning the poetry. He wasn't really censuring anyone on the ground. Like, yeomanry can sing poets across English countryside. So he wasn't sending any spies. But under Queen Mary, this was quite strict. But under Queen Elizabeth I, who was a Protestant ruler and daughter of Anne Boleyn, the censorship became an instrument of governmentality. So that is one way of understanding the history of censorship in curtailing the freedom of speech. So what I'm going to do is, there is one example of what kind of punishments were given to these people who offended the state or who offended the church. I give one example of, again, Queen Elizabeth's reign. So scholar Frederick Siebert traces in Freedom of the Press in England, 1476 to 1776. According to Siebert, the rapid rise of the government control of printing took place during the reign of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I's reign can be seen as the high point of the entire 300-year period of the average pattern of the three factors. Three factors remain, defines the history of censorship under the rulership of Elizabeth I. So she was a Tudor ruler. One is number and variety of controls. So when I say how censorship became an instrument of governmentality under the reign of Elizabeth I, it was defined by number and variety of controls. This is one element of understanding the history of censorship in Tudor England. Second is its stringency of enforcement. Elizabeth I was really stringent when she was passing, royal decrees against any kind of opinion, antagonistic views coming or printed in her reign in England. Third is general compliance with regulations. So she did force all the people of England, including poets, writers, and bishops, to adhere to her stringency of enforcement of censorship under her rule. When Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, heralded by the City of London as the Protestant Deborah, the judge and restorer of Israel, she faced the task of revoking her predecessors' political and religious reforms and changing the clothes of government. So that was one thing, how Elizabeth actually brought the idea of governmentality into her work of censorship as a job primarily concerns the state, not just the church. So church's role was diminished. That is the purpose of bringing Elizabeth I, the Tudor ruler, during latter part of the 16th century. Then there was one example I wanted to give. With this, then I will jump on to 18th century France. So both in England and France, from 16th to 18th centuries, the freedom of speech and censorship involved a strict state mechanism. So it became an instrument of governmentality, deemed any kind of view that will be held against the state will not be tolerated. So that is called a strict state mechanism, mostly under the rubric of religion, to control antagonism or any seditious speech, writing or reading against the king or queen. So what was happening around this time was uh, some poets were mocking the kind of illegal affairs happening in a royal court. It may not be necessarily targeted against Henry VIII or Queen Mary or Queen Elizabeth I. It could be one of their family. But this was also not tolerated by Elizabeth I. During her, spies were sent. Strict code of censorship was imposed all over Britain during her rule. One example I will give what happened to one work that actually uh, killed um, uh, one of the that is censorship and freedom of speech. This is one good example. If you actually go against a king or queen, the punishment will be very, very severe, actually. Um, so, so during the reign of Henry VIII, a nun named Elizabeth Wharton claimed the gift of prophecy. So there was one English citizen whose name was Elizabeth Wharton. She claimed that she had the God's gift of prophecy after recovering from illness. She had very severe illness. She survived, and people claimed that she had a gift of prophecy coming from God. So Elizabeth Barton's prophecies attracted widespread attention, especially among conservative clerics. Um, in the highly, yeah, I've been telling about one person called Elizabeth Barton, who claimed that she had a gift of the prophecy. So what had a relation to with censorship, I will explain in a minute. So in 1528, Elizabeth Barton began prophesying terrible outcomes for the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn and his religious governance. So this actually troubled the king, actually. She was prophesying that if Henry VIII, who now took into the Reformation, who broke up with the Roman Catholic Church, if he marries Anne Boleyn, there will be a lot of calamities. Their children will die in infancy. Henry will not have any heir. So these are the kind of prophecies expressed, pronounced by this particular lady called Elizabeth. This was actually, this word went into the court of Henry VIII. So Elizabeth Barton's prophecy that king's marriage to Anne Boleyn will land his kingdom into terrible, terrible outcome. So several texts circulated about the prophetess, and a large compilation of her prophecies, which was compiled into a book called The Nun's Book, was printed in 1533. How Henry VIII government came to know about this Elizabeth Barton was all her prophecies, including that king will be in trouble after his marriage to Anne Boleyn, was published in a book called The Nun's Book. So it was printed in 1533. So the Henry VIII government seized old copies and tried Elizabeth Barton and her followers for treason, for slander against the king, highness, and the queen. So Elizabeth Barton was, because of the publication of the Nun's Book, which was printed in 1533, now reached in London, also reached the court of Henry VIII. She and her followers were put into prison, and they were charged with the slander against the king, highness, that is the Henry VIII, and the queen, Anne Boleyn. So John King described the Tudor years of weathering religion, a time when monarchical government attempted to control public discourse. So subsequently, this Elizabeth was killed. Her women followers, all of them, men and women, were executed at Tyburn in England. So this is what John King calls how monarchical government is now attempting to control a public discourse. So the Nun's Book was no longer a prophecy by Elizabeth Barton, but it was printed as a book, and it actually gave a kind of prophecy that King's rule in the coming years will be very, very bad for English people all over Britain. So that prophecy angered the authority of the Henry VIII. So now this became a public discourse. So what becomes a public discourse? Any kind of prophecy, if that get into book publication, ultimately ended this, prophetess, that is Elizabeth Barton, but also health followers. So that is some of the examples coming from Tudor England. So what I'm going to do in the second part of the lecture will be censorship in the 18th century France. This will give a different kind of historical understanding vis-a-vis what we have discussed in the first part of our lecture or in today's talk. Second will be how censorship was very, very a complex structure under the reign of Louis XV. So there was one statesman, Marlasheps. Marlasheps was involved in this whole process of censoring the kind of works published in Bourbon, France during the 18th century. So specifically, we are discussing about what is censorship and its complete operation under Bourbon regime in France in the 1850s and 1750s and 1760s. So that was the thing. So that was 18th century, mid 18th century. So such were the formal characteristics of the typographical old regime, that is the regime of Louis XV. How does the system look if one studies the operation of censorship behind the facades of title pages and privileges, that is from the viewpoint of censor themselves. So unlike the first part of my lecture today, which discussed about, completely killing or burning of the books. In France also it was happening, but I'm going to explain a different kind of history, that there was a complex structure involved in censoring any work under the reign of Louis XV, especially Marlasheps. Marlasheps was the minister under Louis XV, and it was very, very complex that I'm going to explain in rest of the lecture. So hundreds of their letters and reports to the director of the book trade admission addressed to the Marlasheps. So who is Marlasheps? His name will recon in the rest of the lecture. Marlasheps was a French statesman, politician, counsel, and the director of the book trade. So preliminarily, his task was the director of the book trade between 1750 and 1763 in France under the reign of Louis XV. So hundreds of work, whatever the work, letter, even written by Voltaire or Rousseau, Diderot, Thomas Hobbes, any work coming into France will go into the scrutiny of the director of the Book of Trade Office, that is Marlasheps. Marlasheps was a French statesman, but deeply influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy. One thing happened after the French Revolution. Marlasheps was, though he encouraged a liberal kind of look towards, publishing the works of Voltaire and Rousseau. Sometimes they were so offensive to Bourbon monarchy. They were condemning feudalism. They were outrightly critical of nobles and the clergy. How third estate were not looking after. So Rousseau and Voltaire were directly advocating that kings' powers must be limited. This sometimes angered the Bourbon monarchs, Louis XV. But Marlasheps, despite he himself comes from aristocracy and director of the press and trade during this time, always sympathized the writings of Rousseau, despite being annoyed, but also Voltaire and Diderot. He was protecting a lot of Enlightenment writers and thinkers around this time. But unfortunately, he was guillotined along with his daughter, his son-in-law, his granddaughters. All were killed during the Reign of Terror in 1794. So Mara shares, what is this paradox or crux in the life of this French minister, statesman, and the director of the Book of Trade was he was the one instrumental in giving freedom of speech, letting go of some of the opposing voices under the reign of the Louis XVI, was finally killed by French revolutionaries, especially under Jacobins in 1790. So his empathy with the Enlightenment did not save him in the end. That was, one of the twists in the life of, Marlus Schaps, the French statesman, politician, and the director of the book trade between 1750 and 63. So what all these books are regarding reaching the office of the Marlus Schaps, the director of the book trade, because these works were confidential communications to Marlus Schaps. The reports assessed books with a frankness that would not appear in formal approbation. Sometimes, to be sure, they merely provided assurance that a manuscript contained nothing offensive to religion, morality, or the state, the conventional categories that commanded a censor's attention. So whatever this director of Book of Trade, Marlus Schaps, was receiving was he has to make sure that none of the manuscripts, hundreds of manuscripts were coming to this director of the Book of Trade office in Paris. But he has to make sure that none of these would be offensive to religion, morality, or the state. But many conveyed positive endorsements about style and substance, even when they consisted of a sentence or two. So this is the complex realm of censors. Censors were the people who were professors, sometimes medical practitioners, sometimes foreign ministers, sometimes aristocrats, all were working as part of censors. As a censor, your duty in 18th century France was to look out whatever the manuscript assigned by Marlus Schaps, the director of the press, the director of the book trade. So you have to assess. This is very complex layer of understanding. This is concerning about history, about geography, about foreign affairs, but sometimes about some kind of stories, sometimes enlightenment thinking. All these works are coming into the Book of Trade office, that is Marlus Schaps' office. But censors themselves were writers, administrators, some of them coming from aristocratic background, some were bourgeoisie. So it involved a complex set of techniques before approbation was assigned to any particular work. So that is the argument. That is, they are not censoring directly. That is my argument concerning the history of censorship under Louis XV. So when censors felt enthusiastic about a text, they heaped on the pledge. If some work is really good, approbation will be given. But censors were like reviewers of nowadays books. If you submit a journal article in any language, whether Hindi or English or in history, any discipline, it will be sent for a reviewer. So reviewer come up with a 2-3 page comment upon whether this book can be published or recommend or rejected. So this was the kind of work entails the job of a censor in 18th century France. So it involved sometimes, it might offend the foreign policy of Louis XV. So it doesn't mean a censor was rejecting a manuscript because the writer or the author was criticizing the state's policy. Not necessarily. It didn't have good French in its prose. Sometimes primarily based on grammatical errors, lack of structure, lack of coherence, lack of any kind of lucidity were the prima facie reasons for rejecting a book, or rejecting any collection of letters, or rejecting any collection of communication between authors. So this is a complex, painful work that involved censors during the 18th century France. Then I will give the example of um, 2, 3. Then I will jump on to Rousseau as well. Rousseau is very important before I finish my lecture. Since we do not have time, I have lots of examples, but I will give 1, 2. Far from sounding like an ideological custodians, the censors in 18th century France wrote as men of letters, and their reports could be considered as a form of literature. So this is one way of understanding what is a censorship during the 18th century. Yes, they were protectors of the king and the church, but they were also very, very liberal concerning what kind of works can be published. A third powerful voice. So this is one of the censors' comment concerning the question of censorship in France. That militated against censorship was the tradition of freedom of expression, coupled with a high regard for belles letters. Belles letters is a French term that represents the literary merit, the critical worth of a book, a critical worth of a publication. So this was the one of the criterion, deployed by the censors in France during the 18th century. So literary merit is one of the criterion before it goes to the publication. Not necessarily it will offend the state or the church. So French censorship, unlike the examples coming from Stuart, England, offers a very complex structure of looking at the manuscript, reading it. Sometimes what these censors, they were not paid. That is the one thing. So there were around 600 censors. 600 members were part of this censorship work from the office director of the print trade in Louis XVI France. So all 600 were not given money. Some were, doctors, some were lawyers, some were astronauts, some were into the Enlightenment writing themselves. But they had to work on the behalf of the crown of Louis XV. But if anything was too offensive, they have to write a detailed reportage concerning whether this particular work can be published or not. I will give the example of Rousseau, then I will stop that. Then their literary concerns stand out, especially in the negative report, where one might expect the heaviest concentration on the vetting of heresies. Heresy is the one of the benchmark in examining the critical validity of a text or any book that was published during the 18th century France. So, for example, one censor condemned that light and bantering tone of a treatise on cosmology. So, one book came on cosmology. So, the censor wrote in his report that this is a light bantering, so it can be published. So, this is one different kind of works were coming to the department of the Book of Trade. So, another censor rejected a legal treatise on the grounds that it used inaccurate terminology, misdated documents, misconstrued basic principles, and was full of misspellings. So grammatical errors came to this particular censor. Uh, it's a book on legal treatise. He rejected not because it was criticizing Louis XV government, but it used inaccurate terminology, misconstructed principles, and full of misspellings. So this is a complex kind of examining a manuscript in the world of censors in the 18th century France under the reign of Louis XV. So an account of the campaign of Frederick II offended another censor, not because of any disrespectful discussion of French foreign policy, but rather because it is a compilation without taste and without discernment. So there was no literary merit in this style of writing. So it was criticizing the foreign policy of Louis XV. But censor duty was also to make sure that it will not offend uh, the crown. But here the censor was not looking into that aspect. He didn't recommend this particular work because it is a compilation without taste. So there was no literary merit he saw in this particular work. So in the 18th century France, the census reports also contained plenty of comments condemning unorthodox ideas. Again, any kind of blasphemy that is, too radical or too unconventional, that might, destabilize the overall outlook of the state, the overall dominance of the Catholic Church were condemned by most of the censors. So their duty was also certainly to defend the church and the king until the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Then what was the role of Mala chefs in strengthening the publication of the Enlightenment literature? He himself said one thing. This French minister, statesman, who was the director of the print and trade during mid 18th century, said one thing concerning as the director of book trade. So according to Mala chefs, a man who reads only books that originally appeared with the explicit sanction of the government, as the law prescribes, would be behind his contemporaries by nearly a century. So Mala chefs held the view that I am allowing these books clandestinely sometimes without the knowledge of a king, without the knowledge of the crown, without the knowledge of the French parliament. Because if we do not allow books to be published, one thing is on economic grounds. Book trade was flourishing around this time. So Mala chefs exactly want some kind of taxation from the book trade to the treasury of Louis XV. So because based on that consideration, he was, overlooking some of the works that criticized the Louis XV government. Second one was he was influenced by Enlightenment thinking, the Enlightenment movements in 18th century France, particularly that of Diderot's publication of Encyclopedia. It was publishing a lot of, blasphemous articles against Bourbon monarchy, giving some kind of firmament among Parisian public that it is time to overthrow the, Bourbon regime and create a kind of, people's republic. This idea didn't emanate overnight in 1789. It was precisely because of the writings of Rousseau, writings of Voltaire, writings of Diderot's Encyclopedia, and other likewise Enlightenment thinkers that Mala chefs was sympathetic with. So he clandestinely, sometimes he was giving the official stamp without the knowledge of the royal crown or the French parliament. So he believed that if people read with this, their awareness about the idea of society, the idea of enlightenment, like Rousseau's Emile is there. Then Rousseau also wrote another book called Julie. I think Emile was burned down because it contained one passage. Emile is nothing but a series of letters written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French Enlightenment thinker and philosopher. What they were doing around this time, all their works, according to the advice of Mala chefs, were printed from Geneva in Switzerland. Sometimes they were coming from Germany. All were printed outside France. So all writings of Voltaire and Rousseau were banned under Louis XV regime. So they were coming with a foreign printer's name, with an anonymous identity. So their names were not revealed. Sometimes Voltaire went to Mala chefs and asking, some of the writings which were considered a heresy and seditious to the norms of the church, norms of the French government. He asked Mala chefs that publish these seditious letters written by me in the name of Rousseau, because Voltaire disliked Rousseau. There was a rivalry between Voltaire and Rousseau. Rousseau wasn't doing this kind of thing, but Voltaire, who was befriended a lot of the Enlightenment kings around this time, certainly trying to influence the French minister and statesman Mala chefs to publish some of the seditious works that was so offensive to the Bourbon monarchy, to publish on his enemies' names. Rousseau was one of the name requested by Voltaire when he met Mala chefs, but Mala chefs rejected it. I can publish with anonymity, but I will not publish on whether on Rousseau's name or on your enemy's name. So this will be unethical. But I'll allow your ideas to get published. So that was the kind of censorship was going under the directorship of Mala chefs in the 18th century France. What was happening then? What about Denis Diderot? Denis Diderot was um, actually reprimanded by French Parliament, uh, saying that your encyclopedia was publishing a lot of articles on ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was also coming from Emily. Emily of Rousseau was a treatise on education, right? Here, how a parent should educate their children. But also, this education tells about the idea of equality, fraternity, and liberty. All French citizens were equal. So universalism was the one advocated by Rousseau and Voltaire in their writings, which for them, for the state, deemed quite offensive because they were emphasizing the equality of the third estate, which was subordinate to first two estates. Rousseau was saying that nobles and the clergy were not coming from some incarnation of God or sanctioned by God. They were human beings like you and like me. So this offended the Bourbon crown. Denis Diderot, the publisher of the encyclopedia, was publishing. That encyclopedia published nearly around 80,000 articles over the course of 16 years. So what happened? Denis Diderot was raided by French police sent by Louis XV crown. He was threatened to be killed. So what Malashevs said that I will ban encyclopedia. What Malashevs later did was he took Denis Diderot told to Malashevs that I cannot protect all my writings. Police are going to come in 2 days of time for inspection, since this was now censored by French Parliament. So Malashevs himself took hundreds, thousands of writings that was there in Denis Diderot's encyclopedia office. He went to that press office of Denis Diderot, and he took all these thousands of works. He stole, he actually took them and secretly stored at his home without the knowledge of the crown, without knowledge of the French Parliament. So for next 6 years, after 1759, Denis Diderot was secretly circulating all Enlightenment works, but also works about philosophy, works about humanism, works about eradication of the feudalism, eradication of royal privileges. All were clandestinely published with the blessings of Mala Chefs, the French minister, who was an aristocrat, who was extremely sympathetic to the Enlightenment writings. So in that way, Denis Diderot was saved. His life was saved, his works were saved, thanks to Mala Chefs, who was in charge of the censorship in France. So these are the two examples. I'll stop here. There are a lot of works I wanted to speak, but I think we have only 1 hour time. So this is the brief outline of understanding the complexities of censorship in 18th century France, vis-a-vis how state used governmentality as an instrument to kill any opposing voices in Tudor England, especially under Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth I. These were, female rulers, but they were ruthless when coming to suppressing or killing any opposing voices during 16th century Tudor England. So I'll stop here. That's my lecture.
Thank you, Dr. Vijaya Ramadas. So I will now open the floor for discussion. There is going to be a short Q&A for about half an hour. Anybody who's interested to ask any questions, please unmute your mic and yes, proceed.
Yeah, Nikhil MK has a question, I think. Yeah, Nikhil, you can ask the question.
Yes, Nikhil, can you open your mic?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So my question is this: so you identified two axes along which the censorship-based scrutiny of most of the texts was happening, namely one of heresy and one of sedition. So my
Hmm.
question is, so did how did a thinker like Thomas Hobbes fit in within the scheme of things? Because on one hand, he shifted the basis of the legitimacy of the sovereignty from a sort of a divine sanction, a divine right-based paradigm, to that of a vague, ahistorical, abstract social contract narrative, wherein
Hmm.
he sort of was on some plane practicing heresy, while on the other hand, he was more or less reinforcing or giving more currency to the legitimacy of absolute sovereignty. So, how does
Hmm.
this fit in with also the conflict of the church and state? Because on one hand, he could be accused of heresy, but not necessarily sedition in the proper sense of the word. So, how was this viewed both in the Tudor period as well as the period of French Revolution?
Tudor monarchs were, especially Henry VIII, was tolerant, but under Elizabeth the First, they were absolutely sure, strict about anyone offending the state. But in France, I think it was tolerated. Even Hobbes' works were tolerated. They were translated into French. And some of the books, imported books came to the office of Malesherbes. But he was, like I said, if you have a minister, though who was from a privileged background, sometimes, these ministers who were in charge of, censorship, whether in England, in France, were sympathetic to their aristocratic background, or if they were men of letters. The second consideration is men of letters. If Thomas Hobbes falls into that kind of literati, a influential thinker, and his ideas inspired even some of the aristocratic groups across Europe, including France and England. So then was literati was the one criterion uh, employed by censors, both in England, in France, not to give them, uh, you know, lenient punishment was there. We are banning your book, but later on, the book will appear anonymously as an imported work coming from Switzerland, and it will be freely distributed clandestinely. Uh, what is called this pirate books, pirate kind of channels were one of the way of saving any kind of heresy that was attributed to Thomas Hobbes or Rousseau or Voltaire. So that's how it was. The system of censorship was operating both in England and in France between these two centuries.
Yes, sir. So my question is basically also that since Hobbes was not necessarily critical of state, as in Hobbes was vouching for absolute monarchy, but I
Absolute
mean,
monarchy. Yeah.
so yeah, so did the late, the reign of terror or um, even the reign of Louis, or I mean, did they explicitly have an issue with, and did this lead to more sort of friction between the church and the state? Because sort of Hobbes's narrative sort of should have created a cleavage between the church and the state, because on the one hand he was discarding the state and vesting more authority, discarding the church and vesting more authority on the state. So
He was a
how did this?
supporter of the absolute monarchy rather than
Yes,
church, right?
yes, sir. So did
Yeah.
this sort
Yeah.
of what was the
Mm-mm.
impact of the church-state relationships in the light of Hobbes's work?
Now, what happened during the latter part of the 18th century in France was church role was, subservient to the king. Under Louis the 14th, he was the absolute monarch, right? The grandfather of Louis the 15th. Louis the
Yes.
14th was an absolute monarch. So church was not given complete reign, but they were a sun king. He described himself that I'm emanated from this Suryavamshi lineage sort of thing. So this is a divine rights of the king. That was the kind of thing that enabled, Thomas Hobbes' work also, since it's praising the rulers rather than the church, were obviously helping their reign to continue. But what happened during the French Revolution was Hobbes was not living in Paris, right? If he would have been in Paris and he would have been the supporter of the monarchy, he would have been guillotined. That's what happened to Malesherbes. Malesherbes, who was an empathetic enlightenment thinker himself, but who comes from aristocratic background, who had extremely tolerated the writings coming from Diderot, uh, Voltaire, Rousseau, and others, was eventually guillotined by Jacobins in 1794, because he actually went in exile after the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. Then again, he returned in 1792. He argued for Louis XVI's, allegations against Louis XVI, that Louis XVI, his wife Queen Mary Antoinette, conspired against the establishment of the French Republic. They conspired with Austrians and Prussians, that was Germans, to bring foreign troops to kill the Parisians. That was the allegation made against Louis XVI. So Marla Shucks was involved in this legal battle of protecting the Queen and the King. That was the mistake. He's written to Paris in 1793. So he was arrested, his family was arrested, his daughter, son-in-law, granddaughter's husband, whole family was guillotined in 1794 by French revolutionaries. So if Thomas Hobbes would have been in Paris, he would have been guillotined. So that was very, very radical structure of happenings happening, spontaneously unfolding in the streets of Paris in revolutionary days, especially during the Reign of Terror in 1792 and 1794. So concerning this, tolerating, it's beneficial for these rulers, right? So that might be the reason they have tolerated him, right? He was not so radical as Rousseau's work of Emile. Rousseau's works directly criticizes the state, right? It also offends the church, some of the sections of his work in Emile and Julie, but also social contract. Social contract denies it negates the absolute monarchy. In Placer, he says power to the people. It's the people who can, the power rests with the people. King has to listen to his people. So he can only be a constitutional monarch. That is the fundamental argument of Rousseau in his social contract, in his writings in social contract. So he actually enshrines power to the people by, criticizing the role of the church and the state. So they were actually, his writings were burnt in the streets of Paris around his lifetime. But Malesherbes were protected Rousseau's writings as well, because they went again with a Swedish publisher from Geneva, and they appeared with anonymous writings without, directly informing that this was the work of Rousseau. So it's the anonymity their writings were distributed across salons and private networks of intellectual conversation among bourgeoisie in the later 18th century France.
Thank you, Professor.
The next question is from Dr. Ravikant, chairing the current project. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Vijaya Ramadas, for a fascinating introduction to censorship in France and England. My question is about, there's a larger thing happening here, right? In the sense that you seem to be hinting about a certain standardization of print taking place. What is allowed in print, right? So there's a filter in the censorship, which is not only checking what is challenging authority of the church on the one hand, and of the king and the queen on the other, but also of what is happening to the authority of literature itself, right? So because it is still the initial years and decades for print, right? And there's a hybrid form getting created between orality and print. So the standards, right? Literary standards, grammatical standards are also being set, while they're also setting standards of morality, sexuality, what is said, what can be said, what cannot be said, etc., etc. So there is a wide range to this. I wish to, ask just one question about it. This whole kind of, complex domain of things that And it's a confused picture, right? That this wonderful fellow, Malish Shrubs, right? Shrubs, he is trying to, help the people he is supposed to control. So you also have. So I wonder when is this notion of freedom of, expression, right? What does it mean in oral terms, and what does it mean in terms of print? Because this freedom, I guess, the freedom of expression also comes after the censorship is instituted, and this freedom is not assumed, right? Suppose we think of a parallel of this rumor, right, which this dhobi in Ramayana, right, is attributed to the dhobi that Ram kept Sita, took her back, in spite of the fact that Ravan had kidnapped her, etc., etc. So here, the opprobrium, right, is not on the dhobi, but on the king. So it's very interesting. Similarly, if we go to, travel to Italy and look at the cheese and the worms, right, where this Menocchio fellow, who's the peasant, who has been speaking a whole lot of things against the church, and he's then burnt at the stakes. And our historian Carlo Ginzburg, he tries to locate the source of his revolutionary statement, so to speak, in the books that Menocchio has kept at his house. But he can't find any traces of that. Which is to say that there's a lot happening in the oral domain, but the authorities cannot find anything which has a material kind of existence.
They cannot show the material evidence.
Yeah, which is what the print offers. And it's very interesting that there's also an international racket for publishing, as we had during the freedom struggle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just as you could not really check and censor the rumors during 1857 and 1942, etc., etc., right? But print it is where you control people. So very fascinating period also. There are comparisons, interesting comparisons between standardization as well as kind of authority. So thanks a lot, and between Europe and India. Sorry for this long winding comment. I enjoyed it.
No, sir. No. You wonderfully summarized the context between orality and the difference between orality and print. Print actually enabled the state to have more mechanism of strict censorship than the orality. So licentia was one thing. I think it's coming from Latin tradition that existed during Stuart England, but also Tudor England. So this licentia was a kind of oral tradition that prevailed among English society. What is licentia? Inability to speak. One is ability to speak the truth. That is one criterion. Second is the ability of praise. Praise was accorded to the king, but this licentia that coming from Latin tradition, from Latin works around this time of Tudors. Speaking truth means if a queen was not ruling properly, or a king was not ruling properly, the truth must be upheld. So there was a dilemma among the literate sections of the English society, be it peers or nobles or even bishops, who are influenced by the English Reformation and Enlightenment movement. They wanted to criticize, so that can be part of the truth. So according to this idea of licentia. But they couldn't able to do. If they speak, their lives were in danger. So this was the kind of located in the oral tradition, orality, what you are saying, which was very complex thing. Print is altogether a different kind of development came later on. So yeah. Yeah, Shirini, yeah.
Yes, sir. So I had a doubt. Since today's talk is about censorship, one thing comes to mind. So in Discipline and Punish, Foucault talks about the uh, public execution of Robert François Damiens, and it is narrated in torrential eloquence, and we get a picture of how brutal it was. And in one of the essays by Orwell about Charles Dickens, he talks about the standard book of upbringing children. It's called The Fairchild Family. And there too, we get a picture of how brutal it was. And by the time Orwell was writing, he himself talks about how now it is available in pretty expurgated editions. So, in that sense, how do we situate spectacle or the object of spectacle as used by the state apparatus in connection with, or in opposition to censorship?
Yeah. The thing of spectacle, like in Tudor England or 18th century France. Like I
Yes.
gave the hangman, right? Hangman was one of the officials whose sole duty was to bring all prohibited books, and he has to burn in front of the public, whether in the city of London or in the city of Paris. So hangman was the official position designated both under Tudors in England, but also under Bourbons in France. But anyone, who had written very kind of, offensive language to the state, like I gave the example of Elizabeth, right? One of the lady who criticized the marriage of Henry the Eighth with Anne Boleyn. So she was prophesying that king's rule will be upheld. There will be a lot of calamity for Henry the Eighth if he marries Anne Boleyn. So she was executed in public only, right? Whatever Henry was killing all his opponents. Uh, this is also a kind of Book of the Nun, right? Uh, Book of the Nun tells about this lady Elizabeth prophesying about the downfall of Henry the Eighth. So anything they feared that if this prophecy comes, it actually demoralizes the psyche of the king, the spirit of his rulership. So they deemed it a kind of outright attack on not only monarchy but also monarchy's future. So Henry's the Tudors rule will come to an end. That kind of prophecy she was making. So she was actually it's a public spectacle, right? The entrenching of state's authority uh, in the form of governmentality by censuring, not only burning the book, but also executing the nun who spoke about the fall down of the Tudor monarchy under the Henry VIII. So this was one of the discipline and punish what Michel Foucault talks about. Yeah, can be seen since the time of Henry VIII. There are lots of examples I didn't give because of the lack of time, but it was done by even Elizabeth I. She was killing her opponents. Especially under Mary, it was even brutal, I think. Mary, the sister of Elizabeth I, she killed thousands of Protestants.
Yes.
Most of the Protestants were arrested and imprisoned. Their books were burnt in the public domain, which can be called as state spectacle of unleashing terror to tell the subjects that if you were to question the king, the authority of the king, or authority of an English, or write anything like heresy, the deemed heresy or seditious, not only your work will come to an end, but your life as well. So that is the kind of demonstration of spectacle, both under the reign of the Henry VIII, his daughter Queen Mary, but also the other Protestant daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth was the first. She ruled for a long time. She was praised as some queen with because one of the work criticizes her marriage with one of the French prince, actually, Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth I, daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. So when this particular author wrote about, because she was 46 and this French prince was around 25 or 24. So there was an age difference between Queen Elizabeth marrying at the age of 46 because she wanted to bear some child progeny for the future of the Tudor monarchy. Elizabeth I was the last ruler, and Tudor dynasty ended with after her death. in 1603.
It's
Because
not.
she couldn't able to bear that criticism. Because there were lewd remarks and some kind of nasty comments written about her in that book. So she brings an ordinance, and since there was no censorship law, she had to issue a royal decree. So this is another way of intervention of the governmentality by creating a public spectacle. Those who are opposing even Queen's personal life is ad hominem, right? The writing was ad hominem. It wasn't criticizing Queen's policies as a ruler. It was criticizing her personal life. So those writers were punished and hanged in front of the public in England. So these are some of the examples of the notion of public spectacle unleashed by the state through the instrument of governmentality. Both under Tudors, I think Bourbons were much more because of the Mala chefs. He was the minister, so he was utilizing all his state power to protect the Enlightenment thinkers. This could have been the order of the day, even for Rousseau and Voltaire, but they were protected and saved by some of the French nobles like Mala chefs. Yes.
Right. So I actually wanted to ask how do we compare, in a sense, how a ruling regime utilizes the tool of spectacle on one hand and utilizes this tool of censorship on the other, to promote their own interests, their own
Tool of
political
the spectacle and
tool of
tool of the
censorship.
censorship.
Yes.
This was pretty visible in the case of Tudor rulers concerning Louis Bourbon monarchy. It was very complex. A tool of the spectacle was not really unleashed because you have a presence of one powerful minister whose duty was to protect the church and the state. So this tool of the spectacle was not visibly demonstrated during mid-18th century, I'm afraid, concerning thanks to uh, the saving mechanism deployed by Mala chefs, but also a lot of the censors. Censors themselves were some of the professors from University of Paris and all. So France and England offers a different example. But in the case of Elizabeth I, the tool of the spectacle, but also the tool of the censorship were simultaneously deployed to show that she was a sovereign monarch. Hers is the ultimate authority. So no one can question neither her policy nor her personal life. There won't be any kind of freedom concerning any kind of ad hominem concerning the life of Elizabeth I. So she was one good example of tool of spectacle embedded in the tool of censorship to gain the control of the state, but also sidelining the authority of the church. She was this is where instrument of governmentality was more reinforced during the reign of Elizabeth I rather than under the Henry VIII. So in France offers a different example. That's what I think. Yeah. Nikhil MK has raised a hand.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So, sir, like you had mentioned the concept of governmentality. So, and spectacle embedded in censorship in the reign of Elizabeth, and not so much in the Tudor reign, and not so much in the French regime. So
Yeah,
when
Louis the 15th.
yeah, so when we talk of censorship, there is a repressive aspect, and when embedded in governmentality, it would also show the productive aspects of censorship in terms of how creating certain technologies of self in people. So, but did it not in a sense backfire in the French context, at least, with many broadsheets as being circulated with the emergence of print culture, many broadsheets in support or glorifying the convicts and people executed, small time robbers who were publicly executed, circulating in the 17th and 18th century France, which would be mostly a working class thing and might necessarily stay outside the strict purview of state. So how did the state sort of deal with these emergent sort of criminalities from the perspective of state with the possibilities that print revolution offered?
Okay, this Enlightenment movement began from the mid 18th century onwards. We know that these were sans culottes, what you are saying, working class people in Paris or in other parts of France. Especially in Paris, they were referred as sans culottes. So sans-culottes had the readings published by a lot of the bourgeoisie. So sometimes, these morality also played a role. All were not necessarily, disseminated in public domain through print. Sometimes, morality, like, Professor Ravikant mentioned about the morality. Morality also have a spatio-temporality during, before the time of the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. One thing with the Louis XV, Louis XV was more involved in luxurious lifestyle, with his mistresses, parties. It's the same with Louis XVI. Unlike Louis XIV, who was involved in, building the roads, reservoirs, looking after his French farmers, looking after the French taxation system, looking after the welfare of his people. The other two rulers, Louis XVI and Louis XV, were weak rulers. So these sans-culottes were, received this kind of, enlightenment treatment because of the presence of the Voltaire, Rousseau, and salons. French salons were operating clandestinely, and most of them were supported by governesses, some of the French noble aristocrats who wanted the idea of debate, the idea of exchanging ideas, but also the idea of, intellectuality. So these attracted them because they got fed up with, same kind of church and state, common people not having any kind of representation, what was happening during a famine time in this particular year. So this is the one of debate occurring in the streets of Paris. Then question of unemployment. So who will represent our grievance of unemployment? This is what sans-culottes were asking. But Rousseau provided the outlet for these grievances that was coming at societal level in France around this time. Social contract limit the power of the king, give more power to the people. So this was well understood by sans-culottes around this time. So finally, what happened? Louis XVI couldn't able to handle the kind of economic crisis. Between 1785, 1788, there were a series of famines occurring in France. There was shortage of food production, rise of unemployment. France also supported American War of Independence in 1776 that drained the treasury of French government. So Louis XVI couldn't able to handle. But Enlightenment thinking already was well rooted in Parisian society. Bourgeoisie want a kind of power structure that will give them a political representation. This kind of political representation came directly from the writings of Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, Voltaire, especially encyclopedia. Especially Rousseau's influence was very direct on the French Revolution. Though Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau did not live to see the revolution, their ideas were not only circulated or disseminated in the circles of the bourgeoisie, the educated middle class in Paris, but also to the sans-culottes, French working class. So things went out of hand, like when French Parliament was convened in 1789. Then they said that Louis XVI was very hesitant to listen to the people. So he brought some Swiss guards, foreign mercenaries, like Swiss guards and German guards. So this angered the Parisian crowd. So they went into the Bastille. They attacked the governor of the Bastille. They killed all French and German and Swiss soldiers who were deployed to protect the Bastille. The deployment of the foreign troops also angered the Parisians. So they lost trust of the king. All this was happening because, in a way, thanks to the print culture. Enlightenment emerged because of the print culture during the 18th century. So there is a nexus between the influence of the Enlightenment movement, but also the actions of the French people, both bourgeoisie, but also sans-culottes, the working class population in Paris.
Thank you.